Hello and a warm welcome to Green Spaces. My name is Lynette Manzini. Thank you very much for joining us today. This program is brought to you every Tuesday between 12 and 1 p.m. We talk all things climate change, the environment. These are important issues that we want to discuss. In today's conversation, we are going to be discussing the issues of cyclone-induced disasters, measures to minimize harm. So we have been experiencing cyclones since 2010. They have hit Zimbabwe in different magnitudes and have caused harm in different communities. And in today's program, we want to talk about some of these effects, some of the effects of these cyclones and what can be done in the future to minimize this harm. And joining me here in the studio is Chisi. He is a climate justice expert and the director of Reyna Trust. Welcome to the program, Sydney.
Thanks, Lynn.
Thank you very much. We are smiling, but currently in Malawi, it's a sad situation. Just talk to us about Cyclone Freddy and, the effects in Malawi so far.
I think first things first, we want to send our condolences to the people of Malawi and people of Madagascar as well, and part and parcel of Mauritius, because that is the route that Cyclone Fred used on its way into Africa. Some catastrophes and damages in Mozambique as well. So we would really want to pass our heartfelt condolences to the people who lost their loved ones to that shred of heavy, violent cyclones. And from, as you might be well aware, the talk about Cyclone Freddy has been ongoing, and people are saying, Freddy is coming, Freddy is not coming, Freddy is coming, Freddy is not coming, Freddy is diverted to South Africa, Freddy is gone. Then all of a sudden, Fred came back and he was more violent and more disruptive. But as we speak right now, we are beginning to count our losses. Cyclone Freddy has begun to retreat back into the ocean, and the damage that has already happened in Malawi has seen almost more than 300 people dying, more than 100,000 displaced, more than 300 people still missing, a lot of infrastructure damaged. What is left of us is now to quantify that and putting into monetary terms to see the value of the loss that the people of Malawi have suffered and encountered. But also, as you might be well aware, it's not just about losing your loved ones. It's not just about losing your property. It's also about the psychological trauma that communities would suffer. And as we speak right now, there has to be strong solidarity that goes to Malawi in the advent of this climate-induced disaster that they have suffered. But also, it's a wake-up call to everyone in the world to remind them that wherever they are not safe. When these tsunamis come in, when these cyclones come in, when these hurricanes come in, they will leave a trail of disaster that will always remind us that climate change is real, it's upon us, and if we don't act, then it's our own fault as a human race not to deal with it.
I like that you're already talking about the aftermath, to say what happens after it has hit. Is there enough assistance? Who is coming to help who? Do we have a support system for, in the case of Malawi right now,
Sure.
What support systems are in place to ensure that they can rebuild, the psychological trauma people have faced? Do they have, experts in those areas who are actually able to assist? Because, recovering from losing a loved one is very difficult.
Sure.
And no amount of money, can deal with that. But I want us to, come back to Zimbabwe and say, Cyclone Freddy, to what extent did it affect, the environment and also the people of Zimbabwe? Why I'm asking this question is, I think late February, we received a message around a warning about Freddy. And people were actually joking, saying, like you said, Freddy gave us a wrong signal, or it's the meteorological department's equipment that is not working. And I remember the government actually stopped children from going to school. Talk to us about the effects of Cyclone Freddy.
Lynn, season of cyclones in Zimbabwe and mainly in the southern Africa, it's always between February and April. And many of those cyclones will be upon us, different names, different character, and different velocities and ability to destruct. But when it came to Zimbabwe, yes, true, Cyclone Fred threatened to come sometime in February. But what then happened was that the intertropical convergence zone, which was supposed to drive the wind into Zimbabwe via the Mozambican basin, had to change the direction of Cyclone Fred, and it had to go southwards. That's why there was more rain and more damage in Maputo and South Africa, more than it was in Zimbabwe. There were, of course, untold rains that happened mainly in the southern region of Zimbabwe, but they were not life-threatening. We are happy and we are lucky that we did not lose any lives, but infrastructure was equally damaged. To those communities that do not have climate-proof infrastructure, they suffered a lot of damages. Schools, roofs were swiped out. So there was that narrative that it came and it went back. But because of the different pressures playing out within the Indian Ocean, this time around, when it retreated back into the Indian Ocean, it did not die out. So it regained its pathway, and this time around it went towards the north of Zimbabwe. So Zimbabwe was saved, but what we only got were rains that were almost unprecedented in most of the regions. If you talk about Chipinge, Mani, and mainly the Masvingo province as well, and Matabeleland South. So in actual fact, we survived that. It had nothing to do with our meteorological department. Actually, at the present moment, Zimbabwe has got one of the best meteorological systems in Southern Africa after South Africa. And the data that we had was on point. The only challenge, Lynn, is that how do we transmit that data to ordinary people so that they are proactive and they are prepared to meet any other challenging catastrophes that could come from climate-induced disasters.
I just want to say to the viewers, Mushini, we meteorological department, Kufa, it actually was on point. It's just that the intertropical convergence zones were diverted. I'm learning new English words on this program today. So, you spoke about the rains and how it damaged infrastructure, and there were so many rains. How did it impact crops in the areas that it rained mainly?
Definitely, if you look at our cropping season, you would find that by this time around, most of the crops within fields are beginning to ripe up. Some are actually beginning to dry up, preparing for harvest. So excessive rains would definitely mean damaging that crop. And from an African point of view, or from an ordinary small-scale farmer, you would actually understand that lack of rain causes a drought. Too much of rain causes a drought, because then you're not able to harvest anything. And we realize that most of the cropping within those regions that I've mentioned, if you talk about southern of Manicaland and part of Masvingo province, as well as Matabeleland South, they really suffered damage to their crop because of excessive rains, which would mean also impacting on the food security of those communities as well. So when we're talking about climate change and we're talking about climate change adaptation, we also talk about how are we going to adjust to these kind of seasons so that at least we put up crops that are resistant to such kind of cyclones, but also to have a general understanding of the dynamics within the rainfall patterns that we are likely going to have. Sometime in September last year, we were told that we are likely going to have above average rainfall, especially in regions 2, 3, and 4, right? Which automatically meant that if cyclones were going to hit, they were likely going to hit on those regions. Definitely, any farmer would definitely know when to crop and what to crop, so that at least they can realize a better harvest. So in other areas, the little rain that came in to them because of Cyclone Fred made their cropping even better, and they're celebrating.
I want us to move on to the minimizing bit. You spoke about, the warning around. No, it wasn't a warning. It was information around the rain we're expecting to have this particular year, which means they should be the relationship between the meteorological department and the small-scale farmers should be strengthened. What is the current status?
We have our agriculture extension offices in almost every other district. And these agriculture extension officers' responsibility is to communicate with the farmers. I don't know whether you know the word called domain,
Yes.
Which is a derivation from demonstration man. Basically is to demonstrate to communities what is likely going to happen and the effects that is likely going to happen because of the rainfall pattern that is be untold and that is likely going to come out of that particular season. So in any event, there has to be continuous engagement between the small-scale farmers and the meteorological department, Ministry of Agriculture and Lands through our agriculture extension officers, but also even Ministry of Environment in terms of the adjustments and projections that are likely going to happen within that season. If then that doesn't happen, if there is no flow of information between those who have got information and those that are supposed to use that information, then people will be caught unawares. And the challenge that we are going to be having is that how many of us within our small-scale farm communities have got access to this information and what infrastructure is being put by government into those communities so that they've got easy access to that information. How do we build the capacity of these extension officers and extension offices to ensure that information trickles down to the last farmer and the last farmer is motivated to adjust to their cropping behavior because of the information that they would have received throughout the year and over and above before the rain season begins.
In case you're just joining us, you are tuned into the Feeds at W. This program is known as the Green Spaces. In today's program, we're discussing cyclone-induced disasters and measures to minimize these harms. And joining me in the studio is a climate change expert and the director of Reyna Trust, Sydney Chisi. Sydney, you spoke about the relationship, the need to fortify the relationship between meteorological department and the small-scale farmer and the demonstration man. I learned a new word again today. How old were you viewers when you learned that Mudumeni actually means demonstration man? I was today old. So we are learning. You spoke about why that relationship is important, but what kind of crops, how do you prepare? Because you don't know what the cyclone is going to do. Is it too much water? Is it too much wind? And how do which crops better grow in this? Because you spoke about the issue of food insecurity that is caused by these cyclones.
We have got, generally, we used to have 5 agroecological regions in Zimbabwe, region 1 up to region 5. Mm-hmm. We now have got roughly 7 extension of region 2B and 5B. Mm-hmm. This link tells us that Zimbabwe is getting hotter and drier, and technically it means that the crops that used to thrive in region 1 are likely going not to be thriving anymore. The crops that used to thrive in region 5 are likely not going to be thriving anymore. So what we also need is the ability to adapt to climate change variation that takes place within our communities. But also we need to build resilience within the crops that we're supposed to be building upon. And when we're talking about resilience, we need to build questions around what exactly is needed when we're building this kind of resilience. And the resilience is how do we move from our traditional crops to new crops? And Zimbabwe as a nation has begun to build on what it called the agricultural transformation agenda for 2020 to 2030, where we are beginning now to say people, because of the hotness, because of the dryness that we're beginning to find in our agroecological regions, people now begin to push for what other people call small grains, what Zimbabweans call traditional grains, right? Because they are traditional, your munga, your rapoko, you name them. It's basically because these are drought resistant. And we also need now to begin to ensure that these drought resistant crops become our alternative staple.
I want to interrupt you there, because when you spoke about drought, you said lack of water and too much of water. Will they withstand too much rainfall?
They will definitely withstand too much rainfall because they are already resilient to less rainfall, right? So the idea is now to equip and inform the farmer, right? To say, in the event that you have put up your rapport and then there is too much rain, what then becomes the alternative, right? And what becomes the substitute? So as we are also pushing for all this resilience building within communities, we are also then allowing the ability to train our farmers to multi-crop. So you have got your maize and you have got your rapoko, you have got your nzungu at the end of the day. So you have got your value chain of different crops, so that whatever hits you, you are not likely going to suffer from food insecurity at a household level. You might not be able to have enough for sale to GNB, but then definitely you will not be able to suffer at a household level from hunger.
I think this information you are telling us is very important, because our food insecurity statistics are not looking too good.
No.
When we are blessed with all this land and vast tracts of land and good weather. I think we have addressed the issue of food insecurity and how how cyclones affect food insecurity and what can be done. I want us to move on to infrastructure. We spoke about how, rooftops in Malawi fell and killed innocent lives. If we go back to 2019, here in Zimbabwe, at the Cyclone Induced, we saw loads and loads of people losing their lives, infrastructure being lost. What can be done to minimize the harm in as far as infrastructure is concerned? Because right now, as we're speaking, I'm now afraid of being in a brick, built house.
No, you still have to enjoy going kumusha and still go into your gogos round heart, But what is important is that had we popularize the conversations around climate change and climate disasters and take it upon us as a common conversation, the manner in which we take the conversation on Zim Dancehall, Kujamba Mas Speaker, can we also begin to Jamba Mas Speaker talking about climate change at all levels? How do we ensure that climate change discourse and climate change narrative is within our education curricula, so that we have got a source and foundation to which knowledge is exchanged between the elderly and the younger generation, scientific knowledge and indigenous knowledge systems that we have, so that when everyone else is building, they would actually understand what they need to protect themselves in. I think it's actually in the Bible that the house that stands is the one that is built on the rock. That's very old, and it's very solid, because they knew exactly what was likely going to happen to any house that was not built with a climate-proof mentality. So that's exactly what we are looking at, to say, Zimbabweans, what we need to do is to increase the awareness raising around climate change, but also to bring in the private sector and the government to come together and ensure that they begin to build these climate-proof infrastructure, to ensure that villages and cities begin to be climate smart in all its aspects, the nature of the infrastructure that we are building, the nature of the roads that we are using, but also the awareness that is supposed to be put in place. Because the challenge that is there is because when you have a piece of land, supposedly a piece of land in Bikita, and you are told, no, your house is not climate smart, or it's not climate proof, then what? You're not giving me the money to build another one, right? So for as long as I don't get climate finance to adapt to climate change, then it would mean I'm continuously going to stay in that house, and my children are likely going to suffer the adverse of exposure to any climate disasters that is likely going to happen. So we are also now pulling our ideas together to say, how can then governments begin to promote communities to install climate-proof infrastructure, so that at least these disasters will not happen. In 2019, Cyclone Induced in Malawi, and I'm using this as an example, Malawi had to borrow money from the World Bank so that it could construct a bridge that had been swept away by Cyclone Induced. But that bridge was not climate-proof. And
was it swept away by Freddie?
then it was swept, not even by Fred. Before Fred, another smaller cyclone that came in just swept it out. So what have you done? You have borrowed money, so you're in debt, but you need now to construct yet another bridge. So it's also about how do we build our architectural scientific powerhouse to begin to respond to this. And if you look through what has happened, the tsunamis that have hit places like Japan, Philippines, the infrastructure remains standing because they built on infrastructure that is resilient. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I want us to talk about the vulnerable communities. There are people who are unable to, fortify their homes. You're talking about climate financing, but we don't have the resources as yet. I mean, world leaders are still negotiating, and like you say, maybe not. How do the vulnerable communities fortify themselves in the meantime? Because we want to save lives, we want to make sure they're not swept away, their homes are there. Because I remember even after the aftermath of Cyclone Induced, there are some people still living in tents. Vulnerable communities, I think, need to be in the center of the aftermath. What can Zimbabwean governments, particularly looking at the Zimbabwean government, what does the government need to do?
I mean, coming from a climate justice angle, putting vulnerable communities at the center of a solution is very unfortunate, because there are people who are responsible for the problems that these vulnerable communities suffer. And like you have said, the developed world has made pledges to say they are going to give 100 billion to the global south on adaptation and mitigation for those communities to fortify their communities and adapt and build resilience towards climate change and climate shocks. That did not happen. COP26, we were told there was COVID. COP27, nothing was mentioned. But also we were pushing to say there is an aspect of loss and damage that is suffered by those communities, and people need to be compensated, or reparation has to take place. The developed world just came up with an implementation plan and a fund where there is no fund. So the challenge that is there is the government of Zimbabwe has to build solidarity with other global south communities and countries and nations to say the global north has to meet its obligation and its commitments to climate finance, but also to the loss and damage implementation fund that was agreed at COP27. But beyond that, we also then need, as a community and as a society in Zimbabwe, to say, if the money comes to the government of Zimbabwe, is it likely going to get to my mbuya in Bikiti? So there are also issues of accountability and transparency and finance mechanism that will ensure that a person who lost a house is how that house is going to be replaced. A person who lost a loved one, they are likely going to go through rehab and therapeutic sessions that will also make them feel as if they never lost anyone that they love. So the issue of accountability and finance would have to go hand in hand. But we definitely have to identify where the problem is. The problem is with the global north that has been emitting greenhouse gases for the past 300 years, and it's refusing to be accountable for that, for those crimes that they committed. Now, the people who never really caused climate change are the ones that are suffering the most. And it's very unfortunate.
Very unfortunate. I'd like to thank you very much for joining us today.
Sure. Thanks.
There you have it, viewers. That was Sydney Chisi, and he's saying that the global north is responsible for these tsunamis and cyclones and climate change impacts that we're facing here in Africa, and they should be able to finance the mitigation and adaptation strategies here in Africa. So thank you very much for joining us. Sydney Chisi is a climate change expert and is the director of Reyna Trust. Thank you very much. Until next time, goodbye.
Thank you.